I am live. I continue reading A Lot to Remember. This book, largely about the journey through France, is dedicated to Denys and Charles with love for A Lot to Remember. It was published in 1962 and it is written by Joan Marshall Grant. And she spent a lot of time there, and in fact she even has a map in this book because she's had visions in these places, and she explains the history. It's a part of France, and she has made a little map so that one can follow it if one so chooses. Chapter 5 is Ferdinand de Lesseps. She goes much into history here. A pleasing alternative to following routes nationales through Blois to Brive is to take a more direct line by minor roads to join N20 between Argenton-sur-Creuse and Limoges. From the Indre to the Creuse there are many étanges, shallow, reedy lakes among flood pastures, where browse herds of cattle which look as though they were made of parchment-coloured velvet, their ears and muscles blushed with palest carnation pink. Here the wide, placid vistas, the high skies, seem to belong to Holland rather than to France, a Holland of 200 years ago, when the Low Countries could still offer to the painter's eye a landscape in watercolour, virtually without figures. But the quickest way from Chaumont to the Lot is via Blois and Châteauroux. When I came back from the Lot with Charles, we went to Châteauroux because we wanted to see the original of the portrait, which is reproduced as the frontispiece of his biography of Ferdinand de Lesseps. We searched for it in several dreary galleries of the museum before at last discovering it tacked away in a little room above the stables, or what used to be stables when the chateau housed people as well as things. Below the portrait is the illuminated scroll which conferred on Ferdinand the freedom of the city of London, and in dusty showcases lie the decorations showered upon him by 17 countries after he had proved to them, in spite of their discouragement, that he could translate into reality his dream of linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea by building the Suez Canal. You are the first people for a very long time to display any interest in the Comte de Lesseps, said the guide somberly, perhaps trying to excuse himself for the dustiness of the relics. After Charles tipped him, he looked slightly more cheerful, but when we asked where we could find La Chesnaye, where Ferdinand usually lived when in France, he relapsed into gloom, again at having to admit he had never heard of the place. Had La Chesnaye not been obliterated by a worn fold of my map, we could have reached it by turning east onto D34, 5 miles north of Livreau. But the only clues we had were references to the place in Lesseps' letters, which showed that although it was not far from Châteauroux, the nearest town was Wattan. It was fortunate that we went there, for in the bar of the Hôtel de France we met a Monsieur Merilou, who not only knew the de Lesseps family, but promised to conduct us to La Chesnaye after he had been home to lunch. When he returned, he brought with him a photograph of Ferdinand with his second wife, Helena, and 9 of their 12 children. He had also been kind enough to visit the stationers and ferret through a box of obsolete picture postcards until he found one of La Chesnaye. I was surprised that it looked as though it had been built early in the 19th century, for I knew that it had originally belonged to Agnes Sorel, the wise and beautiful mistress of Charles VII, whose tomb is in the Chateau of Lox. One of her letters from La Chesnay survives, in which she gives meticulous instructions for the care of her greyhound, Carpet, so named because he slept beside her bed and on chilly mornings used to warm her feet. M. Marilou had already told us that the LESSEPS family were no longer in residence, but I felt confident that so helpful a man would have managed to borrow the key. But when I hinted that it would be disappointing not to see the inside of the house, he said regretfully that we would not be able to see even the outside, for the place had recently been sold to housebreakers who had pulled it down. I was not only entirely disappointed, for a biographer becomes closely identified with his subject, and I was afraid that Charles might have found that an abandoned house evoked sad echoes of the old man who lingered, deaf and senile, for 2 years after the tragic failure of the Panama Canal, rather than of the dynamic Ferdinand, who had been so happy there with his first wife, Agathe. As we got into the car, Charles was talking about Agathe, but I was again looking at the photograph of Helena. Even after bearing him 12 children, she looked young enough to be his granddaughter, as she could have been, for when he married her, she was only 20 and he 64. We took the road towards Gillian, and after 3 kilometers, M. Marilou told us to stop at what at first seemed to be farm buildings. But when we went into the great square yard, we saw that the stables which Ferdinand had built for his famous stud of horses were little changed, although now there were cows in the loose boxes and grass was blurring the outlines of the paving stones. Charles was saying the stud belonged to Ferdinand's mother-in-law, Madame de la Melle, who owned La Chesnay. She, of course, was Agathe's mother. Why, of course? I found myself feeling illogically resentful. Why does no one bother to remember Helena? We crossed the road to look at a fine pair of iron gates, which no longer led into a chateau courtyard, but only to an open space of tussocky grass that hides any trace of the foundations. In what had been the ornamental park, there are still a few of the trees which Ferdinand planted. There had been many more, for he loved trees, but only stumps had been left by the timber merchants. Charles was still talking in praise of Agathe. It was his love for his first wife which gave him his extraordinary faith, his tenacity of purpose. If she had not died so young, he might have been content to live quietly here, instead of turning his vast energies towards the creation of the Suez Canal. I wandered away from them, feeling unjustly impatient with Agathe. She had had her children by a young man who was ecstatically in love with her, and from one of them caught a lethal dose of scarlet fever. So she won posterity's admiration by being adored by a famous man and dying young. But it was Helena who had loved him when he most needed loving. Helena who had remained unswearing in her loyalty when he was a failure, derided by the rest of the world. I came to a derelict conservatory, still clinging with struts of rusty iron to a garden wall. Had Helena caused it to be built so that an old man could dream there, and forget that beyond the sheltering glass the winds of time, the winds of fame, were blowing cold? I heard Charles shouting to me that they were going to look at the chapel. Disconsolately I trailed in their wake across a field whose grass was flecked with the purple of autumn crocus. Had Helena planted them here? It pleased me to think so, although I knew they grow wild in this part of France. By the time I caught up with them, they were already in the small 19th century chapel. Cobwebs festooned the shabby altar, and a dusty rosary hung from a broken chair. Dead flies and fusty moths littered the sills of 2 grimy windows. Our kindly Frenchman was so embarrassed at the neglect that we did not linger there, and he was locking the door behind me when I saw Charles staring at an obelisk. which until then we had not noticed because it was in the sombre shade of a great ilex. It is a small obelisk, and on it is carved ICI, Reposez le sang, de Ferdinand de Lesseps, mort le 7th December 1894, or died, embalmé le 9th December 1894. Souvenir impérissable. Deeply moved, Charles began to read aloud. Here lies the blood of Ferdinand de Lesseps. Perhaps, if I had not remembered watching an embalmer at work in the 11th dynasty of Egypt, I should not have realized the anguish of those words. 2 days the body had waited for the embalmers to prepare it for its last journey to Paris, when it would lie beside Agassiz in the cemetery of Père-Lachaise. But to Helena, everything which had ever been part of Ferdinand was precious. So when they had finished, she went alone into the bleak moonlight to bury in the living earth all that remained to her of a great man's body, the strong bowl of his compassion and his brave blood. So that was the end of chapter 5. What was it called? It was called Ferdinand de Lesseps, and it is the story of Ferdinand. Chapter 6 is Rose Red Village. I hope you have a good Tuesday. It is the 15th of October.